Hello, and welcome to the Quantum Fit Podcast. I'm Taylor, and I am your host. This podcast is all about applying the different principles of quantum physics and quantum biology to your health and fitness. This gives us a holistic view of how environmental factors can play a huge role in your overall health. Not just diet, exercise, and developing good habits. If you really want to make lasting changes in how you feel, think, and act, then I'd recommend you listen closely and try to have an open mind to what I have to say. Normally, I just put out one quick 7 to 15 minute long podcast. Keep it short so it's informative and to the point so you don't feel so overwhelmed. But today, I'm giving you two. This will be the second one. The first one is the crystalline origin story. Sorry it was a little long, pushing 18 minutes. This one won't be quite so long. Before moving on to the actual episode, I just want to go over the fact that I don't do any kind of advertisements. Not now anyways. So instead, I ask that you share this podcast with a friend or family member if you enjoyed the message and gained something from it. I want to be able to spread quality and easy to understand content that everyone can take and use in their own daily lives. I would highly, highly appreciate it. Now, time to dig into the meaning of the last podcast episode. I know, it was a little long, but still, I thought it was important, and I liked it. I'm sure you probably gained something from it, even if, maybe a quarter of it had pretty complex words and sentences in there, but anyways, simplifying the passage that I read, it's a theory that proposes that all living beings were created through rock, crystal, and metal reacting with their organic compounds, while extreme apocalyptic-like electrical currents served as a catalyst, as well as heat and pressure and ultraviolet light. I think this theory for the origin of life makes a hell of a lot more sense than the idea that lightning struck biological soup at some point and life was created by chance. No, this idea instead says that life has always been about interacting with the environment and evolving with and because of the environment and information from it. This also answers a lot of questions in life. For instance, why is geometry so essential in growth? Why do certain things, such as asparagus or a sea conch, grow in a spiral fashion according to the Fibonacci sequence? Why are there specific proportions that humans instinctively love? To understand what I mean, just think of someone's face. It's been shown through studies that we look for the golden ratio in every distinct facial feature. Even being millimeters off is enough to throw off the eye, according to the studies. If someone has too few golden ratios, they won't be considered good looking objectively. It's a bit of a dark example, but it makes you think. It makes you think, right? So let's bring these ideas together with the origin story. If we are basically created from semiconductive crystals, we should have many of the same properties. Again, things like being, mainly it comes down to being semiconductive, as well as having crystalline shape and having specific structure. We grow with specific structure. And, as it would have it, we do. We can check all the boxes. We are semiconductive crystals. For instance, water within cells is called structured water. Your mitochondria actually create it. It's also known as the exclusion zone in cells, if you've looked over research or different books or blogs or whatever. This water, this structured water, is highly organized, like powerful scaffolding. That's why it's labeled as essentially being a semi-liquid crystal. Now, this water also happens to be one of the best semiconductors we know today. And the more of it you have in your cells, the stronger your voltage becomes. Which, if you want to know more about that, just go back over my previous podcasts on electromagnetism and healing. When you And then, even when you expand out from the cell, it's clearly shown that tissues as a whole are also semiconducting semi-liquid crystals. Fascia is a really good example, and so is bone. Like the different semiconducting materials that, engineers create today, bone naturally has different metals added to it that vastly increase its capacity to conduct electricity. The different added metals also change up the crystalline structure. And again, bone is, designed, it naturally does this. And speaking of adding metal into parts of the body, have you heard of the different species that use magnetic metal as guidance systems? Birds have a tiny piece of it actually lodged in a specific part of their brain so how it gets there is there's actually specific cells that create this highly organized piece of metal. Oh, and by the way, this metal is, I can't remember what metal specifically it is, but you can only find it in biological systems. You can't find it in nature, or you can't find it naturally, on Earth. It's not in any you can't actually find it in minerals or, whatever. It's only found in living beings, which is pretty interesting. Anyways, this highly organized piece of metal is lodged in a part of the brain, and there's specific neurons that are actually plugged directly into it, and they hold it in place to an extent. Basically, the piece of metal is stuck in place, but it's allowed to vibrate just ever so gently. And these neurons are able to decipher those vibrations as information about where the bird is. This is how birds are able to fly all the way from the Antarctic to the Arctic. Not only do visually they can see things, but it's been shown through studies that they can also find their way, even if they were to basically essentially blindfold the birds. They can still fly, just fine, north to south, south to north, electromagnetically. Bees and even some types of bacteria have this metal as well. There's one type of bacteria that has a single molecule of this metal, the smallest physical piece of this metal you can possibly have. And this tiny sliver of metal is enough to tell it's able to vibrate enough, and it's sensitive enough to tell the bacteria which way it needs to, scurry to, or whatever, pull itself to, however it gets around. And I believe, this did come from Body Electric again, I believe he had said there was 27 known species that have a specific metal in their body that's I believe it's called a metallic, or a magnetic sensing organ. I believe that's what it's called. I'm sure that number's probably higher now. Interestingly, apparently there's 3 species of primate that have it. Anyway, the whole point of this podcast is to get you to think differently about organic systems like the way I do. From reading this passage, it really changed my mind. So what you need is, when it comes to life, I think it's good to think of it as having crystalline and static origins first. Okay, everything comes from being crystalline and static. Then organic and moving parts came afterwards. Thinking in this way, in my opinion, I think helps you both predict and understand how and why living things react to their environment, and why they're so sensitive to things like light, electromagnetism, heat, cold, the list goes on. So, anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast and the previous podcast. I thought you might like something like this. It's a little unique and kind of extra out there as far as science goes. So if you have any questions or comments about this podcast or any podcast or anything really, reach out to me on Instagram at RealQuantumFit, on my personal Facebook page, Taylor Kelson, or send a voice message across the Anchor app. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.